And it's recording. Good. So the portion is Reeh, and if you have the Eitz Chaim, we are on page 1061. If you have another edition of the Chumash, just look for Deuteronomy, the portion Reeh, or if you have a Bible, you're looking for Deuteronomy chapter 11, verse 26. So as far as I know, any edition of a Jewish Bible will have the Torah portion still marked in the Torah section of the Bible. Anyway, so the portion this week, Moses continues the discussion with the people of Israel about laws that are to be observed. I want to focus on two things, but just kind of introduce the portion the way the portion itself introduces it. See this day, Re'eh Anochi. So sometimes the Torah portion has the name of the first word, as it is in this week's portion, Re'eh Anochi. Sometimes it's found a little bit later in the verse. See this day I set before you blessing and curse. Blessing if you obey the commandments of the Lord your God that I enjoin upon you this day, and curse if you do not obey the commandments of the Lord your God, but turn away from the path that I enjoin upon you this day and follow other gods whom you have not experienced, right? So blessings if you follow the covenant and stay faithful to God, curses if you stray from God's path and follow other gods. Then verse 29, when the Lord your God brings you into the land that you are about to enter and possess, you shall pronounce the blessing at Mount Gerizim and the curse at Mount Eval. It's E-B-E-A-L, but in Hebrew it's the letter Vet, so Mount Eval. So in a couple of portions, we'll see how exactly the people of Israel were to be divided when they get into the land of Israel. So this isn't just some kind of, once you get there, just know that there are these two mountains in central Israel. By the way, the Samaritans, which are a group of, a small religious group that are not Arab, they are not Jewish, it's unclear whether they call themselves Palestinian or whether they're Israeli. I don't know that for sure. But in what is now known as the West Bank, outside of the city of Shechem in Hebrew or Nablus in English, are the two mountains of Gerizim and Eval. And Mount Gerizim is a holy mountain for the Samaritan people. And I know about it, and if you Google Samaritans in Israel, I'm sure you'll come up with a lot of information about who these people are. You might be aware of Samaritan from the Christian Bible, the Good Samaritan that Jesus meets on the road down to Jericho. And so the Samaritans were, in Hebrew, they are Shomronim. But in English, they're known as the Samaritans. This group of people who are not exactly Jewish, but have Jewish kind of practices, and they have a Bible that is almost exactly like our Bible. Hi, Saul. Hi, Bill. I'm just talking about the beginning of the portion Re'eh. It's on page 1061 in the Eitz Chaim. It's chapter 11, beginning with verse 26 in any edition of Chumash or Bible that you have, about how the people of Israel are supposed to be found on two mountains, Mount Gerizim and Mount Eval in central Israel. Mount Gerizim is still a mountain that is used today by the Samaritan people. And I was just saying that the Samaritans are this group of people who are Jewish, that are kind of like Jewish. They're certainly not rabbinic Jewish, but they could be biblical Israelite, similar, because they have a Bible that is similar to our Bible, that has extra verses in it. So it's just fascinating to do biblical research. If one uses the Samaritan Bible, which is known in Aramaic as the Peshitta, then there will be a couple of words here and there that will be different from our Bible that kind of help understand a story a little bit better than written in our edition of the Torah. And all of this is just a further tangent on the idea of Mount Gerizim, because every Passover, they do a Passover sacrificial ceremony where they're actually slaughtering a sheep on Passover, and they have this whole ceremony on Mount Gerizim, where the elders of the community are dressed in white. I remember when I was there in Israel for a year of study in college, so my junior year of college, so that was the Passover 1983, the Hebrew University did a field trip to Mount Gerizim to kind of watch the Samaritan Passover ceremony. So it's quite fascinating. There were a couple of busloads of us who went there to see this. So I don't remember if I actually saw it or if I'm picturing in my mind's eye a video that I saw of this, but we were close enough that we saw this sheep being slaughtered. So it's a fascinating ceremony, but the Samaritan people go way back. As I said, they're found in the Christian Bible, and the book of Ezra refers to the Samaritans as well. So, like I said, we're at the beginning of the portion Reeh. Mount Gerizim, Mount Eval are these two mountains that are supposed to symbolize the blessings and curses. And when we get to the portion Ki Tavo in a couple of weeks, we'll see how the people were supposed to be arranged on these two mountains when they get into the land of Israel. And the Levites are supposed to be reciting the blessings and curses, and the 6 tribes on one mountain, 6 tribes on the other mountain, responding Amen to this list of curses. So we have then this, we are introduced in this portion to this idea of wanting to express, or Moses encouraging the people to express their commitment to the covenant. It was a theme that was in last week's portion too, because in the portion Akev, we find what is the middle paragraph of the 3 paragraphs of the Shema. The middle paragraph talks about if you follow the covenant, then the rain will come at the right time. If you neglect God's ways, then the rain will come at the wrong time, and that will be the punishment. So this is a theme that continues in this portion. And what I wanted to focus on, one of the 2 things I wanted to focus on, is if we turn ahead to page, the beginning of what is in the midst of the 3rd Aliyah. So I want us to look at page 1070. Part 1070, or chapter 13, beginning with verse 7. So if you're in the Eitz Chaim, it's page 1070. Whatever other edition of the Chumash or Bible you have, look for Deuteronomy 13, beginning with verse 7. So here, the pages before this, Moses was reiterating to the people how important it is to follow the covenant and not to be tempted by the indigenous pagan population. And it gets pretty specific here, and I wanted to share this, verses 7 through the end of the chapter, verse 19. So I want to read this in English and then spend a little time on this, how we can make sense of this today. If your brother, your own mother's son, or your son or daughter, or the wife of your bosom, or your closest friend entices you in secret, saying, "Come, let us worship other gods, whom neither you nor your fathers have experienced, from among the gods of the peoples around you, either near to you or distant, anywhere from one end of the earth to the other. Do not assent or give heed to him." Okay, so if your immediate family member, your sibling, specifically your brother, it doesn't say your sister, your brother, or your father, or your wife, no, your brother, your son or daughter, or your wife or a close friend. If any one of these people who are close to you try to entice you to idolatry, and no matter where that God with a small g is, whether it's indigenous to the land of Israel or from whatever end of the earth it comes from, do not assent or give heed to him. Okay, if this was all it was, that would be fine. A reiteration, don't let idolatry enter into your family. Don't be tempted by your own family members or close friends in the ways of idolatry, okay? But it goes on. Do not assent or give heed to him. Also, show him no pity or compassion, and do not shield him. But, verse 10, take his life. Let your hand be the first against him to put him to death, and the hand of the rest of the people thereafter. Stone him to death, for he sought to make you stray from the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Thus all Israel will hear and be afraid, and such evil things will not be done again in your midst. So it's quite clear that if anybody tries to entice anyone to idolatry, and not just anybody, even if it's your own wife, your son or daughter, your brother, or your close friend, they entice you to idolatry, don't just wave it off. Don't just try to get them to be quiet about it. No, you have to do the opposite. You have to report them to the authorities, and you have to be the first in line to stone this person to death. Okay? That's part one of this law. Part two is, if you hear it said of one of the towns that the Lord your God is giving you to dwell in, that some scoundrels from among you have gone and subverted the inhabitants of their town, saying, "Come, let us worship other gods, whom you have not experienced," you shall investigate and inquire and interrogate thoroughly. If it is true, the fact is established that abhorrent thing was perpetrated in your midst, put the inhabitants of that town to the sword, and put its cattle to the sword, doom it and all that is in it to destruction. Gather all its spoil into the open square, and burn, now get a load of this, and burn the town and all its spoil as a holocaust, small h, to the Lord your God. Khalil is the word in Hebrew. V'sarafta va'esh, burn it, you shall burn it with fire, et ha'ir, the city, ve'et kol shlala, and all its spoil, Khalil. So that's the word that is translated here as Holocaust. La Adonai Elohecha, as a Holocaust to the Lord your God. And it shall remain an everlasting ruin, never to be rebuilt. Let nothing that has been doomed stick to your hand, in order that the Lord may turn from his blazing anger and show you compassion, and in his compassion increase you, as he promised your fathers on oath. For you will be heeding the Lord your God, obeying all his commandments that I enjoin upon you this day, doing what is right in the sight of the Lord your God. So it's one thing to preach against idolatry, right? And one of the commandments of the 10 Commandments is not to have false gods, right? Do not make a graven image, et cetera, et cetera. So we know very well how throughout the Torah, or at least from the book of Exodus on, when we become a Jewish people, that how wrong it is to worship other gods, how possibly God is pictured as vengeful and jealous of other gods, and wanting to ensure, and Moses reiterating it throughout the Torah, that we are not supposed to follow other gods, right? So the second paragraph of the Shema about following the commandments, included there, of course, is not to worship idols. But the third paragraph of the Shema about the tzitzit are supposed to focus our eyes on the commandments so that our eyes do not wander to be enticed by other gods. So the enticement, the attraction of idolatry is strong, so strong that it is taught and reiterated countless times throughout the books of the Torah. But nowhere is it the punishment for idolatry so graphic as it is here. And so that leads us to ask a couple of questions. First is that in verse 18 it says, "Let nothing that has been doomed stick to your hand, in order that the Lord may turn from his blazing anger." So there isn't any anger expressed in these verses until this very verse. In other words, we're told that if your immediate family member or close friend entices you to idolatry, you're supposed to kill them. Nothing about God's anger with that. If you hear that a town in the land of Israel, a Jewish town, a majority of the population then becoming idolatrous, you are then supposed to destroy this town and leave the ruin there. Don't build up on top of it. Again, leave it as a ruin. And then only at the end does it say that this is a reflection of God's anger, that we're appeasing God's anger and making God feel better. So the first question is, how is it that we can do something so violent in supposedly the name of God? And what kind of lesson does that teach us? I want you to think about that question and then offer up, whether you just unmute yourself or put in the chat, whatever you're comfortable with, a thought or comment about this. And number two is that to think about this, that the rabbis never followed through on this commandment. So if you look below the line, put the inhabitants of that town to the sword. So there is a phrase for this, that this town that would become this Jewish town that becomes an idolatrous town is called an Ir Hanidachat. And that's based on the Hebrew word in verse 14, Yatsu anashim b'nei Belial mikirbecha v'yadichu. So the other form of the word nidachat, yadichu, that's the word. So Ir hanidachat is a concept in Jewish law. And below the line, why so comprehensive a punishment for an entire town rather than simply punishing the guilty? Right? It's one thing if you're not supposed to be, if Jews aren't supposed to be idol worshipers, punish the idol worshipers. Why punish the whole town for the sake of the idol worshipers that are in the town? So not, in other words, 100% of the town weren't idol worshipers, but if the majority were, you're supposed to destroy the entire town. Why? In all likelihood, the Torah deemed it inconceivable for a good person to remain in a town totally given over to idolatry. In the absence of a supportive community loyal to God, the lonely, faithful individual would either leave in disgust or remain and become corrupted. Later, so that's an interesting concept, and the rabbis talk about that idea in a number of ways. In other words, where should one live? The rabbis talk about what kind of community one should live in. And of course, the rabbi said you should live in a community that has a Beit Midrash, a house of study in it. It should have a doctor in it. These are the kinds of places that we need to look to live in. So if you set these standards, these values for what should be in a community and what kind of community we're looking to live in, then it would make sense that these are the places that Jews should be living in, and Jews shouldn't be living in places that don't have a synagogue. So that's why Chabad has it as its mission to go to the ends of the earth to find any place where there are Jews and set up shop, and so that there be a town. So whether it's in the Himalaya mountains in Nepal, or whether it's in Montana, or whether it's here in Olney, there is Chabad there to ensure that it's a place where God dwells. So therefore, that should be our Jewish goal, to be living in a place with other Jews, to be able to do Jewish together as a community. And so if Jews find themselves in a place where there isn't another Jew, or even more so, if a Jew finds him or herself tempted by idolatry, then, well, they deserve the punishment that's coming to them. That's one idea that the rabbis are suggesting. But then the below the line comment continues, later the sages deemed it impossible for such a situation actually to occur. They considered it to be a purely hypothetical situation, included here to warn us of the serious consequences of idol worship. So my only argument about that is that there is a section of the Talmud known as Avodah Zarah. And let me just pull it off my shelf. My Talmud professors will not be happy with me that it took me that long to find the tractate on my shelf. It's volume 16 of the traditional volumes of the Talmud. And in it is also, you see here, some volumes of the Talmud have, just there it is, have a few tractates that make up the volume. So here, Avodah Zarah is the main one, plus Horayot and Eduyot, two other minor sections. But there's a whole section dealing with idolatry, and I'm just looking to see how many pages it is. There are 5 chapters dealing with laws pertaining to idolatry, and it is 76 pages of laws in the Talmud and discussion in the Talmud. And in that tractate, Avodah Zarah, just a second, Saul, in that tractate is discussion of this law from the Torah about the city that goes astray, the Ir Nidachat. Yes, Saul.
Okay, so I'm looking at a Devor Torah I did in 2015 at the show.
Yeah.
And as far as, I'll talk about idolatry in a minute, but it says, God wanted the people to be in a holy temple. And what he was afraid is that if the people use the pagan temples, to do their worship, they
Right.
may take over,
Right.
those pagan attributes
Practices.
to it.
Right.
So he wanted them to have their own temple for
Right.
doing it. As
Yes.
far as
Wait. Let me just pause
yeah,
you right there. Just in the context of the Torah portion, that's something we did not look at, which I did not refer to. But yes, in the verses before this is a reference to the commandment to build the house of God in one place that God is going to show the people to build it. So within that broader context, yeah, there's the one place where Israelite worship is to happen. And then there are these pagan places out there. So the uh, and yes, so it's several ideas related to idolatry, how to stay away from the influences of the pagan people around you. Not only should you kind of make sure that to get rid of them, because that's another one of these laws, you're supposed to totally annihilate the indigenous population. So if you don't, you're going to be tempted. And don't be tempted. And here are all the different laws in which you're not to be tempted. You have your own, you're going to be having your own temple. The Mishkan will become a temple, an actual house on solid foundation in Jerusalem. And there's no reason then to be jealous of what the other pagan people have in their temples, because we have our own temple. But it's even more jealous than that. You can't abide any kind of idolatry in any form in your midst at all. Okay, so what else, Saul?
okay. So the other one is really a midrash, but I had mentioned about a book and the movie, The Red Tent. And
Yes.
the Red Tent was where the women would go to menstruate or to
Right.
give birth. And within there, in the movie at least, our matriarchs are passing around a clay idol, Inanna, which is a Marian goddess of love and fertility.
Right.
And Jacob eventually notices it and
Right.
destroys it, but still the people had little idols and
Right. So the
ideas.
only thing about that is that that's before Mount Sinai. So that's the book, The Red
Okay.
Tent by Anita Diamant, based on Midrash about Jacob and Rachel and everything that happened with their family. That's all from the book of Genesis. So it's pre-Torah. So that, yes, there's idolatry there, and it comes, what the consequences of idolatry in that story have on Jacob and Rachel and their children. Yes, that's serves as a metaphor for the dangers of idolatry. But when it comes to actual Torah law, it doesn't really count yet, because the Torah wasn't given at Mount Sinai yet. But it gets to the point that there is a deep-seated, long-standing pagan past to the Israelite people. Gabe.
How much of this idolatry was seeping into the religion at the time of the Tanaim, when the
Yeah. So the Tanaim are it's the name for the rabbis of the time of the Mishnah. So from 100, and Adriana, I see your question in the chat. I'll get there in a second. The Tanaim are the rabbis of the Mishnah from 100 BCE to 200 CE. And yes, there are dangers of idolatry then too, because and also when the Greeks were there before that time as well, the time of Hanukkah, there were always Jews, always Israelites who were tempted by outside cultures and societies. And so in the time of Hanukkah, we know this from historical sources, that with the Greeks, the idea of the gymnasium and sporting events were all done by men only in the nude. And so if Jews wanted to be involved, um, they couldn't, because there was a requirement that you had to look Greek in order to participate in these Greek um, um, events. And so there were Jews, and we know this from sources, who underwent a procedure to reattach a foreskin in order to participate in those events. So perhaps historically, in the time of Hanukkah, what the Maccabees weren't just revolting against the idol worship that was happening in the temple in Jerusalem, they were revolting against the pagan influences that Greek culture had on Jewish society at the time, even to the point of abolishing the covenant. And the covenant, because circumcision is called bris in Yiddish, the Yiddish pronunciation, but that's the Hebrew word brit, which means covenant. So the procedure is entering the boy into the covenant, and so it's a physical act to show loyalty to the covenant. So if you're reattaching a foreskin, it's not just an abstract procedure. It is a concrete act that Jews were doing to totally go against Jewish law and upend their relationship to the covenant in that way. So yes, in the time of the Greeks, there were Jews who even went to that step, but even less than going to that extreme step. There were many Jews in the time of the Greeks who acted Greek, who had Greek names, who adopted aspects of Greek culture. There's discussion in the Talmud about an actual question: what are there good things the Romans brought to the Jewish people? And the rabbi, there's an actual question that the rabbis discuss. It's in the tractate Brachot. So first tractate in the Talmud where rabbis are having this discussion, and the rabbis are saying terrible things that the Romans did. They have bathhouses, and the terrible things that happen in bathhouses. They built bridges which led to tolls. They do taxes, things like that. So they're talking about the terrible things that Romans did, but it just meant that there's tremendous influence of Roman culture and society on Jewish culture. And in fact, the method of study that the rabbis developed, that is Talmudic study, is related to Greek and Roman philosophical study. So the same methods of logic and deduction are very similar to Greek and Roman methods of legal discussion and study. So the rabbis themselves said, well, some things about Roman society would be okay, but other things are not. So they allowed this slippery slope to begin, saying that aspects of and there's some rabbis who had Greek and Roman names, and so why is that okay? But other aspects of the society are not okay. So you can have the fundamentalists who say absolutely nothing about outside society is okay. It only has to be Israelite Jewish. And there are others who would say, well, some things are okay, some things not. You just look at the Jewish community today. Why are the ultra-Orthodox dressed the way they are? And why do they not have access to the internet or television? Because everything about outside American culture, if you're talking about the ultra-Orthodox in America, everything about outside culture is bad for you. Whether it has anything to do with religion or not, it's just bad for you. And we're going to stay segregated, apart, and not have anything to do with outside culture, or you have a rabbi who looks like me, who is dressed like, if I take my kippah off, I look like any other white American, right? So I'm dressed like them, similar style of dress. I have I have an English name because my parents gave me an English name, and their parents gave them English names, right? We give our children English names. We give them Hebrew names too, but most of our kids are known by their English names, not their Hebrew names. So all of that's okay because we want to blend in, but it's a matter of a question of how much of the outside society we are incorporated, that how much of their values are being incorporated into our values. And it's always a question for religious communities. What aspects of American culture that seep into our Jewish community? Is that good for the Jews or is it bad for the Jews? So it's an interesting question. I just want to get to Adriana's specific question. And I'm pulling off of my shelf a Hebrew dictionary, and I just want to look up the word Khalil, which is translated as Holocaust. If you see her question, Adriana's question in the chat, I just want to see in the dictionary what it has to say about, no, actually, I'm not going to use this dictionary. I want to use this dictionary. This is a classic biblical Hebrew dictionary called the BDB, named for the three editors, Brown, Driver, Briggs. So, and I think, Adriana, that we looked this up, that I looked this up in Torah class, on the Friday morning Torah class, when we discussed this. So the word in Hebrew is Khalil, and I just have to find it in the dictionary here, and how they translate the word. So I'm sorry about this tangent. Okay. There it is. Just one second. Here. So Khalil, entire, whole, or Holocaust. Those are three translations of the word Khalil. We have it in the Bible. It's in Ezekiel. It's in like Khalil Yofi, entire, perfect in beauty. And then Khalil Techelet, holy purple, and that is in Exodus. Some of the fabrics for the Mishkan are described as Khalil Techelet, completely blue. But then, so if something is being burned completely, then that is Holocaust with an H. Since the Shoah, using the word Holocaust is, you would think, is sacrosanct, especially in the Jewish community. So why would the editors, and Adriana's question stands, why would the editors of the Jewish Publication Society translation, which this is, who are all Jewish, choose to use the word Holocaust, knowing what it would prompt in the reader, that you kind of would stop right there and think about the Holocaust of 1939 to 1945 and not be able to get beyond that, or take a while to understand, oh, that is an actual word with a small h. But yeah, so Adriana, I can't answer your question why they chose to use that. But
So,
technically speaking in English, it means to burn completely.
okay, thank you.
Yeah, so I would have used a different word based on Jewish history, but technically speaking, it is a word that can be used in this context. So back to the idolatry conversation here in the book of Deuteronomy, that we are experiencing a very a very strict fundamentalist approach to that is a very jealous approach to ensure to ensure Israelite identity and the purity of Israelite identity, that it should not be tainted in any way by idolatry, to the point that even people in your family become pagan. You have to be the one to throw the first stone, literally, to kill them, to eradicate idolatry from your society, from Israelite society. And what all the rabbis are doing is, the rabbis are saying, we are suggesting that we as a rabbinic Jewish community, we are teaching that we are not as strict extremist fundamentalists in our life. These are the same rabbis who reinterpreted eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, to make sure that that was not strictly followed literally, but rather monetarily. They also said that the rebellious child, that law of executing the rebellious child never was and never would be. So they changed and reinterpreted a number of extremist, fundamentalist kind of laws in the Torah to be kind of watered them down to make them more palatable for their own modern, in their time, Jewish culture. So when we, as modern Jews, read this today, I personally can say that I am disgusted when I read this. And it kind of smacks of ISIS and what ISIS does in the Middle East in their very strict fundamentalist approach to Islam, and killing anybody else who does not abide by their approach to Muslim law. And that, you can't, there's no two ways around it. This is exactly what that looks like. And you look to the Inquisition that the Catholic Church promulgated and did for hundreds of years in Christian Europe and also in the New World. A strict fundamentalist approach to Catholicism, and anybody who did not subscribe to that would be put to the fire, actually, in punishment. So it's not, so you can't imagine Jews doing this at all. And the rabbis are saying, don't worry, that we did not do this as Jews, but it laid the groundwork for other monotheistic religions to have such a fundamentalist approach. And that's a danger I see, the danger of any fundamentalist law like this, because of how it's interpreted by other religions, and how in the name of religion, violence is sanctioned. And that for me is a problem, especially when we have in this very same portion, beginning with the very next sentence of chapter 14, laws about dealing with poverty. So how can you, on the one hand, be so violent against those in your own family who might be tempted by paganism, and on the other hand, those in your own family who might be impoverished? And you are warm and friendly and reaching out to the poor in the community, but on the other hand, you are killing and destroying who could be the very same people who might express any kind of pagan pagan practices. So I did want to just focus in a couple minutes that we have left, just on one idea here in chapter 14 and 15, where it deals with poverty in your midst and what you're supposed to, how you're supposed to, well, chapter 14 are the laws of kashrut, what birds, animals, and fish. It's chapter 15 that deals with every seventh year, You're supposed to let your land lie fallow, and what to do with the so-called Jewish slaves. Anybody who is indebted to you, who can't pay off a debt, they can work for you, but to pay off their debt, and they're supposed to go free in the seventh year, every seventh year, so that poor people don't remain poor people forever. And there's just a reference, just to understand how important it is to deal with poverty, for the book of Deuteronomy on page 1079, chapter 15, verse 12. We're told, if a fellow Hebrew, man or woman, is sold to you. So fellow Hebrew doesn't get the essence of the Hebrew. Ki yimacher lecha achicha ha'ivri. If your brother Hebrew is sold to you, right? It's not your fellow Hebrew, just a member of the community. It's your brother Hebrew. And if you compare this, as the commentary suggests that we should, to chapter 21 in the book of Exodus, where we have these laws of slavery, we have ki tikna eved ivri. It just simply, when you acquire a Hebrew slave. But in Deuteronomy, it's ki yamacher lecha achicha ha'ivri. It's not just a Hebrew slave, it's your brother who has to do this. So the attitude of the book of Deuteronomy becomes more personal, and trying to instill the lesson that these people who become poor in your community, don't see them as other. Don't label them as in a way that they are different from you, right? Exodus labels a person who sells him or herself into slavery as a slave. In Deuteronomy, it is your brother. So no label is attached. So and despite the dire circumstance that a person finds him or herself in, that leads them no choice but to become indentured servants in order to pay off a debt, they are still they have to be considered your brother. Barbara, do you have a question?
Yes. Doesn't the brother Hebrew excludes the female who is only sold, is not sold, but the father could sell her?
Right. So yes. So there are slight differences between a man or a woman who is sold into slavery. And yes, men in society at the time of the Torah, men are in control of their destiny. Women are are controlled by the men in their life, whether it is their father until they are married, or their husband. So yes, a father could sell his daughter into slavery in order to pay off the debt, or the father himself could, the man himself could sell himself. Yes. So those are technicalities of the law, Barbara, that highlight the sexist nature of Israelite law. But despite the sexism that is there, still, my point is that Deuteronomy makes it clear, in contrast to the book of Exodus, that we are a community of brothers and sisters. That's what Deuteronomy wants to teach us. We won't harbor pagan people in our midst, but anybody else, as long as we're part of the covenant, no matter what our condition is, poor or wealthy, etc., we all are part of one community, and we all need to take care of one another and see each other as brother and sister. So I think it's fascinating, the contrast between the stark violence of dealing with paganism in your midst to the stark compassion for dealing with poverty in our midst, and that you can have both, how you can have both in the same parsha, besides being in the same Torah, is quite fascinating. So any thoughts or comments before we we close, even about that idea of the contrast between the how to reconcile the compassion versus the violence within the same Torah portion.
Why the difference between the way that the impoverished are treated in Exodus and Deuteronomy? Is it just a function of the difference of the different nature of the books that we discussed a couple weeks ago?
Right. So it could be just the nature of the book, but even for biblical scholars, it could be the different author of the book. So if we allow ourselves to go there, which I do, it doesn't take away the sanctity of the book to suggest that there could be different authors and different times in Jewish history in which the books were written. So that is a part of it as well. So Exodus, that part of Exodus dealing with the laws could be it's either the J author or the E author or the P author. I'm not sure if P, the priestly author, was mostly the book of Leviticus, but there's also some of the other laws in some of the other books of the Torah are attributed to the P author. So it could be that it's a purely legalistic kind of formula, whereas Deuteronomy is written by D, the Deuteronomist, and they have that author or authors has just a different kind of outlook about the law. Because we have also in this portion, we have a reiteration of the holidays that are supposed to be celebrated. And here in Deuteronomy, we're told the reason for celebrating the holidays, whereas in Leviticus, we're told how we celebrate the holidays. So that's a different focus as well. So we're told to celebrate, but in Leviticus, we're told how, and here we're told why. So that's fascinating. So we need them all together to get a bigger picture. And that's how a traditionalist would understand the different wording and the different focus in different parts of the Torah. We need it all together, and God taught it in different ways so that we get the big picture. Or we could simply see it as different strands of oral traditions being edited into the Torah that we have, and that the different strands could teach us about the authors themselves and their values and what they showed as important. And for the Deuteronomist, in a time possibly where the nation of Israel was not such a compassionate nation, perhaps having laws that express compassion in them could help change the nature of society. So all these ways are ways of understanding the differences between how the law is presented in Deuteronomy and how it's presented in the other books. Any other thoughts or comments? All right, folks, so have a good rest of the day, and I hope to see you all. So there's Minyan this evening at 7:30. Friday, we have Kabbalat Shabbat at 6, and Shabbat morning at 9:30. And everything else is on the website about other programs that are coming up as well. So have a good rest of the day, and stay safe and healthy, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.